Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something huge, something that affected all of us. Our collective response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We want to unpack the lessons learned and what it all means for science, for public health going forward. Our source material for this deep dive is a really fascinating interview. It's with a key voice, someone right in the thick of the pandemic response debate, who's now actually leading a new approach to health in the U.S. So our mission today is to explore that complex tangle of science, politics, and society during what was, let's face it, a truly unprecedented time. We'll look at those early decisions, the collateral impacts, the things maybe not talked about enough, and the vital work now happening to rebuild trust and sort of redefine what institutions should be doing. And joining us to help navigate all this is an expert who brings a really unique perspective.
It's great to be here. I think looking back like this, especially at these insights, it's just crucial. It's a chance for real reflection, real understanding, especially for you listening, as we think about, well, how we move forward.
Okay, let's dive right in. Think back to that initial shockwave. The pandemic hits, and boom, the world moves incredibly fast towards lockdowns. What were your immediate thoughts, your observations from your perspective, with your background in economics, health policy?
Well, almost immediately back in, say, March 2020, my main thought was the potential for just tremendous harm, especially for the poor, for children. It felt, frankly, irresponsible. It looked like a policy designed to protect what I ended up calling the laptop class, people who could just work from home while basically imposing deep, deep harm on everyone else.
Right, the essential workers, the service industry.
Exactly. And this whole idea of 2 weeks to flatten the curve, that was problematic right away. It sent the signal of intense fear. And that fear kind of fed on itself, making it almost impossible politically to even think about reopening later.
And this wasn't just like a gut feeling about the economics, was it? It was tied to your scientific understanding of the virus itself. Because, those early mortality numbers being thrown around were terrifying.
Precisely. It wasn't just economics. It felt disconnected from the actual scientific evidence about who was really most at risk. We knew pretty quickly it was older people, people with comorbidities, not, everyone equally. And yes, those early reports, they wildly overestimated the mortality rate. For instance, in spring 2020, some colleagues and we did an antibody study in California. And what we found was, striking. For every one person officially identified as a COVID case, there were about 50 others walking around who had already had it and recovered, often without even knowing.
50 times more. Wow.
Yeah. So that completely changes the calculation, right? It meant the actual death rate was much, much lower, closer to maybe 2 or 3 per thousand, not the scary 3 or 4% the WHO and others were initially reporting.
Okay, so that early finding must have been significant.
It was critical. And that understanding, that real-world data, directly fed into the Great Barrington Declaration in October 2020. I co-authored that with 2 great colleagues from Harvard and Oxford. We basically called for an end to the blanket lockdowns. We argued for, focused protection, shielding the truly vulnerable older people while letting younger people who faced vastly lower risk from COVID itself live more normally. It was about a risk-stratified approach, not one-size-fits-all.
You mentioned the harms, particularly to children and the poor. Can you elaborate a bit more on that? What kind of collateral damage were you warning about? And did you see it play out, things beyond the virus itself?
Absolutely. I warned very early, back in March 2020, that we'd likely see rises in domestic violence and child abuse. Think about it. Schools are often the first place child abuse gets spotted. Close the schools, and you remove that vital safety net, that intervention point.
That makes sense. A tragic consequence.
It is. And the lockdowns, fundamentally, they sort of devalued the well-being of huge numbers of people who weren't really that vulnerable to getting seriously ill from COVID, but were extremely vulnerable to the consequences of the lockdowns, lost jobs, delayed healthcare, mental health crises, educational loss. The list goes on. These weren't minor side effects. They were predictable and devastating harms.
Okay, here's where things get really interesting for comparison. While most countries locked down hard, Sweden took a notably different path. That's been debated endlessly. What can we actually learn from Sweden's approach?
Sweden is, I think, a crucial counterexample. It gives us real-world data, not just models. They largely avoided those sweeping, society-wide mandatory lockdowns.
Right, it was more voluntary measures, recommendations.
Exactly. Now, some critics point to their initial death rates compared to, say, Norway or Finland. And that's a fair point for discussion in the early phase. But if you look at the bigger picture, especially all-cause excess mortality, that's deaths from any cause above normal levels, not just COVID, Well, Sweden actually ended up having one of the lowest rates in all of Europe and the Americas over the pandemic period.
So looking at the total impact on life.
Looking at the total impact, yes. In terms of protecting overall human life, Sweden's approach looks remarkably successful. It strongly suggests lockdowns weren't necessary and maybe, just maybe, caused more net harm elsewhere.
Despite evidence like that and the concerns you raised, there was such a strong push for lockdowns globally. How did you see the relationship between science and politics playing out, and what did that do to public trust?
It was complicated. If you watch politicians in the West, especially early in 2020, it was clear they were terrified. Not just of the virus, maybe, but terrified of being blamed for doing the wrong thing or not doing enough.
The political pressure must have been immense.
Immense. So what did they do? They often elevated certain scientific figures. Tony Fauci became a global icon, for example, and essentially said, we're just following the science. It became a kind of shield for politicians. It protected them from accountability, you could argue. But in doing so, it actually damaged the integrity of science itself. Science got tangled up in politics.
How so?
Well, it leads to this really important question. What happens when science develops what I sometimes call a God complex? Science is incredibly powerful for understanding the physical world, no doubt, but it's not everything. It doesn't have all the answers, especially about society, values, trade-offs. What we saw during the pandemic was often an exclusion of other crucial expertise from social scientists, economists, ethicists, even within epidemiology, a narrow focus on certain voices. That's a fallacy. You need broader input for such complex societal decisions.
So you're making a distinction here between, let's say, genuine science and something that just looks like science on the surface.
Exactly that. True science, real science, is fundamentally humble. Its knowledge is provisional. It's always testing itself against reality. If reality proves an idea wrong, well, then the idea is wrong. You adapt. What we often saw instead was scientism. It looks like science. It uses the jargon, the graphs, the equations, but it's not really playing by the rules of science. It resists correction by evidence. It becomes rigid, almost ideological.
That's a fascinating distinction. Okay, let's connect this to the bigger institutions. The World Health Organization, the WHO, obviously played a huge role. How did their approach influence this global move towards lockdowns?
Well, my understanding of pandemic planning before COVID, the established wisdom, was basically you don't do society-wide lockdowns. It wasn't in the playbook for something like influenza.
So where did the lockdown idea come from?
It seems both the WHO and Chinese authorities were thinking about the SARS-1 outbreak in 2003. That involved localized quarantines for a virus that spread via droplets less easily than SARS-CoV-2. But then, in January 2020, China locked down the entire Hubei province, a massive undertaking. And they declared victory quite quickly.
Right, the images are dramatic.
Very. Then a WHO mission went to China in February 2020, and after what many observers felt was a bit of a Potemkin village tour.
Meaning they saw what they were shown.
Essentially, yes. A carefully managed picture. They came back apparently convinced the Chinese lockdowns had worked wonders and recommended the West should copy the strategy. The WHO then endorsed this globally. That was a pivotal moment.
And yet you mentioned earlier, by summer 2020, evidence was mounting that maybe this wasn't working as hoped and the harms were significant, especially for younger people, the less vulnerable. Why did the policies persist? Why this closing of the mind, as it's been called?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I've thought about this constantly for 5 years now. One analogy that comes to mind is wartime propaganda. Think about the initial, almost blind enthusiasm for World War I in some countries. Once you've invested so much, shut down schools, damaged the economy, disrupted social life, told people they can't see dying relatives, delayed crucial medical care, admitting it might have been a mistake, or at least not the only way, becomes incredibly difficult. Psychologically and politically.
Too much sunk cost.
Exactly. Sunk cost fallacy on a massive scale. Plus, there was this phenomenon, some call it mass formation, this intense collective fear channeled into a we're all in this together spirit to fight the virus, the common enemy, asking leaders to suddenly say, oops, maybe we overreacted, or maybe there was another way. After just a few months of immense sacrifice, it was almost unthinkable.
So the narrative took hold.
The war against the virus narrative, yes, it created this sort of exceptional state where things normally considered unacceptable, infringing rights, censoring opposing views, devastating livelihoods were justified in the name of achieving victory, even when the goals, like zero COVID, were clearly becoming unattainable for most of the world.
Okay, let's fast forward to now, 2025. You find yourself as the director of the National Institutes of Health in the U.S. That's quite a shift, placing you right inside the establishment you've been critical of. How do you see the current climate? And what's your mission in this role, given everything we've discussed?
Well, look, I think my appointment itself is a symbol of hope, maybe, and yes, in a way, a kind of revolution. Remember, during the pandemic, for expressing the views we've talked about, especially after the Great Barrington Declaration, I faced censorship, were shunned by politicians, media, even scientific
A
colleagues.
difficult time, I imagine.
It wasn't easy. So my goal now, as NIH director, is tied to a broader vision, something the current administration supports, which we've termed Make America Healthy Again. It's about refocusing on population health. The U.S. has a serious chronic disease crisis. Life expectancy was flatlining even before COVID, since around 2012, and we had some of the worst pandemic outcomes.
How does that connect to pandemic preparedness?
Well, it turns out probably the best pandemic preparedness is actually having a metabolically healthy population, less vulnerability across the board.
Interesting. So what's your specific task at NIH?
My specific task is to try and make science work the way it's supposed to work, to help achieve that health goal. That means focusing our investments on, actual health problems, not diverting NIH resources to broader social justice issues it's simply not equipped or designed to solve. And crucially, we have to repair science itself. We have to tackle this replicability crisis.
Oh, yeah, so you mentioned that earlier. Can you explain that a bit more?
It's fundamental. The true source of authority in science should be replication. Can independent teams get the same result? That's how we know something is likely true. But that system got inverted. Authority shifted to publishing in top journals or the pronouncements of prestigious professors, regardless of whether the findings could be replicated. This leads to confirmation bias, to groupthink. Bad science can persist for far too long.
So it's about restoring that core principle of independent verification.
Precisely. We need to realign incentives, promote transparency, make replication studies valued, not seen as somehow less important than novel findings. It's about getting back to the bedrock of scientific integrity.
That sounds like a huge systemic challenge, though, not just for the NIH, right? It affects the media, the WHO, universities, too?
Oh, absolutely. It's systemic. Look, the media, many outlets, failed fundamentally during the pandemic. They often amplified fear and shut down debate instead of fostering critical inquiry. The WHO also made critical missteps, as we discussed. For these institutions to regain public trust, they need an honest reckoning. Something like a morbidity and mortality conference in medicine, where mistakes are openly dissected to learn from them.
With all blame, but with accountability.
Exactly. Without that kind of honest assessment, acknowledging where things went wrong, I don't see how trust can be meaningfully rebuilt. And universities, they have a similar challenge. Many became places that enforced conformity, stifled dissent during the pandemic. They need to get back to being truly liberal institutions, liberal in the classical sense, promoting pluralism, intellectual diversity, a humble search for truth, not policing heresies.
Is that happening?
There's a push for it in the U.S. now, yes, sort of calling to the universities to remember their core mission. And connecting this globally, I'm hopeful the direction we're trying to take in the U.S., grounded in rigorous, replicable science, will be attractive to scientists across the West. But there's a real risk, too, a risk of a kind of second Cold War in science, especially with China's huge state-driven investment in biomedicine operating under different principles, perhaps.
A split in the scientific world.
It's a possibility we have to actively work against. A world where science is fractured like that, like it was with the Soviet bloc, that would hinder progress for everyone. We need global cooperation based on shared principles of openness and rigor.
Wow. This deep dive has really shown just how interconnected everything is, the science, the politics, the institutions, public trust, and how much reflection is needed. We've gone from those initial lockdown decisions and the collateral damage to the role of the WHO, the media, universities, and the very definition of science itself. It's a lot to process.
It is. And for me, personally, this role, this path, it wasn't something I chose, really, but I do feel it's a calling. If I can help make even a small difference in improving the health of science, well, that can have a really big impact on the health of the world.
So a final thought for you, our listener. In this complex world, flooded with information where scientific authority itself has been questioned and sometimes misused, how do you navigate it? How will you distinguish that humble, self-correcting science from scientism? And maybe more importantly, what role can you play in demanding that honesty, that accountability, that reform from the institutions that shape so much of our lives? The search for truth, as our expert says, is ongoing. And your engagement, your critical thinking, is absolutely essential.